Hi, I'm Mike Ebert. We're talking with Mike Licona, who is a New Testament historian with the North American Mission Board. And Mike, we've been talking about evidences for Jesus' resurrection, talking about applying the methods that historians use when they are trying to prove anything really happened historically or any person really existed, and how we can do that with Jesus' life and resurrection. And you've talked about some of the objections and how the evidence really overcomes a lot of those objections. But let's talk a little bit about some of the remaining objections that still hold up, especially on college campuses today, because it seems like more than in any other place, that's where Christianity and Jesus and the New Testament are really under attack these days.
Yeah, I'd say one of the ones I think it's kind of funny is that you have a number of people say that Jesus never existed. And it is pretty funny because, I mean, there isn't a single widely respected scholar in the entire universe that holds that view. The evidence for Jesus is so strong as to be pretty much beyond doubt. There are as many non-Christian sources who mention Jesus within 150 years of his life as there are who mention the Roman emperor, who was Tiberius, at the same time as Jesus' ministry within 150 years of his life. Now, in order to say that Jesus never existed, you have to explain away all of those sources somehow. To say Christian interpolation, or they got their information from Christians. And really, I mean, those kinds of arguments are desperate. Granted, one of those sources, the non-Christian sources, is Josephus, but he mentions Jesus on 2 occasions. One of those passages is disputed, but most Josephus scholars believe that Jesus is mentioned by Josephus in both passages. But surprisingly, the internet folks will say that all scholars say that Josephus' passage was that one in particular that was a complete forgery by a later Christian. And that is completely false. I've spoken with perhaps the leading Josephus scholar in the world, Louis Feldman, who told me that probably in terms of the ratio of Josephus scholars who say that Josephus mentioned Jesus in that disputed passage versus those who say that he probably didn't, is at least 3-1 and maybe as much as 5-1. So for them to say no scholar thinks that Josephus wrote that passage, it just shows that they're completely naive and ignorant to scholarship. And it just amazes me how many people, even college students today, many college students, will look at the online writings and how much weight they give to them. It's as though if you publish on the World Wide Web, that makes you a world-class scholar. When the truth of the matter is the only credential you need to post on the internet is you've got to be able to breathe. That's it. And there just are hardly anyone. I mean, when you look at these, you say, well, who's making these claims? They're not people with PhDs. So they're people like Earl Doherty, Acharya S., who have no more than a bachelor's degree. Now, a bachelor's degree is fine, but you don't call someone with a bachelor's degree a scholar, right, or an expert on these issues. So again, it's just no scholars today really, widely respected scholars would accept this kind of hypothesis because the evidence for Jesus is so good. But that's one of the things going on campus today.
So if you're really going to dive into this, you really need to read some of the material that's being produced by the respected scholars out there in the field. Well, staying on the college campus, what else might I encounter from a professor or others on a college campus these days arguing against the evidences for the resurrection?
Well, I don't know that they'd come so much from a professor, but a professor might say something like the probability of Jesus rising from the dead is astronomically low, given, let's say, you've had 100 billion people approximately walk the face of the earth, and how many of them have been raised from the dead? So even if you don't a priori rule out that Jesus rose from the dead, it's still 100 billion to 1 that he did. And at first glance, that seems to be a decent kind of objection until you really think about it. It would be true to say the chances of Jesus rising from the dead by natural causes would be 100 billion to 1. But like we said in the previous segment, no one's really claiming that Jesus rose by natural causes. The claim is that God raised Jesus, and if God exists and wanted to raise Jesus, well, then the probability is 100%. Maybe I can give a little illustration to help with this. Let's say that my son, Zach, is 3 years old. Now, he's much older now, but say he's 3. And we're by a swimming pool, and they're doing an experiment and walking everybody who lives on the earth now, 6.5 billion people, on water to see if anybody can walk on water. And every single one of them sink. Nobody walks on water. Finally, my son Zach is up, and he's got to go last. And he says, "Dad, I can't do this." I said, "No problem, Zach. We can do this. Give me your hands." So he gives me his hands, and I don't know how much he weighs. At 3 years old, not much. And I said, "All right, Zach," and I hold him over the pool, and I said, "Go ahead and walk on water." And I walk along the side of the pool, and he walks on water. And he said, "Oh, wait a minute. That's cheating because you helped him. You were an external agent who intervened in the situation to help him do that." Exactly. Now you understand what I'm saying about Jesus. By natural causes, no, he's not going to rise from the dead. But if God wanted to raise him from the dead, then it's no problem for him. So the fact of 100 billion people not rising from the dead doesn't do anything to the probability of whether Jesus would have been raised from the dead.
Now, of course, Mike, there are other stories out there in Greek mythology or wherever else of gods and goddesses that maybe rose from the dead and have stories similar to that of Jesus. Is that another thing that people might point to these days to argue against evidence for the resurrection?
It is, not amongst many scholars today. In fact, T.N.D. Medinger, who wrote a book called The Riddle of Resurrection in 2001, he's a senior Swedish scholar. He said that pretty much today the universal consensus is to say there are no clear parallels of dying and rising deities that predate Jesus. Now, he took exception with that, and he thinks that there are 3, perhaps as many as 5. But you know, he loosely defines these things. Like one of those that he says is Baal. But the story of Baal, you know, you hear about Baal in the Bible. The story of Baal is he's the brother of another deity named Mot, and they're nemesis of one another. And so one day they're kind of taunting each other, and Mot says, "Well, Baal, you give up all your stuff, your powers. You're the storm god, the rain, the lightning, the wind, and come on down here and I'll show you who's your daddy." And so Baal says, "No problem," and he goes down there, and Mot swallows him. So how do we know this? How do we know Baal is dead? Because it stopped raining. So Baal's mom and dad find out about this. They see it's not raining. They say, "Oh, it must be Mot." So Baal's mom goes down and beats up Mot and says, "Let my son go." And he says, "No." And so she really beats him up. And he says, "All right, just let me go and I'll do it." So he ends up regurgitating Baal. And it's a few months later. Nobody sees him, no appearances or anything. But how do you want to know how they know he's alive? It's raining. So it's a way of explaining the seasons just in antiquity. A story kind of like, "Mom, what's thunder?" Well, it's the angels bowling in heaven, you know, that kind of thing. That's what the tale was told about. That's not the same kind of thing as the resurrection of Jesus, where the early eyewitnesses were willing to suffer and die because of their conviction that Jesus had been raised. So that's one problem with it. Another problem is that parallel details can be found in just about anything. Think about this. We're all aware of an airplane that took off from Massachusetts early one morning, and between 9 and 10 o'clock in the morning flew into one of the tallest skyscrapers in the world in New York City, somewhere around the 78th, 79th floor, and killed everybody on board and many working in the building at the time. You know what I'm talking about, right?
Sure.
Yeah, it's when the B-25 flew into the Empire State Building on July 28th, 1945.
Oh, actually, that's not what I thought you were talking about, but...
But that's exactly, all of those details I just gave were the same things that match precisely with the 767 flying into the South Tower on 9/11, which you were thinking of. 1,000 years from now, you might have some revisionist historians who say, well, 9/11 never really happened because that was just patterned after the Empire State Building incident, which really did happen. You can look online and find all kinds of photos and testimonies and all this. So, so one, just because it's very similar in its details, doesn't discount the other. And someone could say about 9/11, say, well, wait a minute, the collapse of the Twin Towers, that was symbolic of the collapse of the American economy, which happened shortly thereafter. And make up all these things. The plane flying into the Pentagon showed that it didn't destroy the American government, but at that time there was corruption going on, and it severely weakened the government's power, or the polarity of opinions, the polarization between conservatives and liberals were hurting the strength of our country. You can make up all these symbols for these things and declare that that's a myth 1,000 years from now, and that the videos, the photos were all forged. But you have to show that there's a causal connection between the two. You have to show that there was a cause that made this a myth after the other, rather than just striking coincidences. And that makes it really difficult for those who would say that these striking parallels between this and some other myths, of which there are not too many, really, of dying and rising figures in antiquity, that this one copied from the other. So there are real problems there. And one final thing I would add to that is the early Christians who were debating over whether the Jewish law of circumcision and eating meat sacrificed to idols, that people were sensitive still to following these things and wondered whether Christians still needed to. Are we really to think that these same Christians borrowed wholesale from pagan myths and legends and made up the Christian religion, the biggest event in the Christian faith, based on pagan myths? It just doesn't fit the facts. Paul, who's a pious Jew, who's persecuting the church, who thinks it's a Jewish heresy, isn't going to embrace it because of copying off of pagan myths. It doesn't fit the facts.
Well, Mike, you talked earlier about the importance of people looking to credible scholars and credible research on this topic. Would you point people in a certain direction if they wanted to get started with this and just develop a stronger foundation for the historical case of Jesus' resurrection?
Sure. The first thing I'd refer them to would be our website, fortruth.net, the numeral 4, truth.net. And here we've got some really good scholars like Gary Habermas and Craig Evans, who have written on various issues related to the resurrection of Jesus or the truth of Christianity. In general, we've got a whole section on Jesus. We've got one on the Bible, the trustworthiness of the Bible. We've got one on science, written by top-shelf scientists and philosophers of science. We've got one on God, a section on God that deals with the problem of evil and evidence for God and answering arguments against God. We've got a section on world religions, one on cults and denominations and things like this. So folks can get a lot of their questions answered through that website. If they're more interested in, say, studying about the resurrection of Jesus, they can watch a number of my debates on there to see how this holds up to answering some of the skeptics like Bart Ehrman, like a Richard Carrier, like a Dan Barker, and others on the fortruth.net website under the Jesus section and his resurrection. If they want to read some books, Gary Habermas and I co-authored a book together that's a self-study course on the resurrection. Comes with software and a video game that helps you master the information in the book, called The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. If they really, really, really want to get into a lot of details with the resurrection of Jesus and go very deeply with it, they can read N.T. Wright's book called The Resurrection of the Son of God, 2003 book, a little over 800 pages in it, or my book that just came out this year or in 2010, called The Resurrection of Jesus, A New Historiographical Approach, which is 718 pages. So both those books are going to cover a whole lot of issues related to the resurrection of Jesus.